Hello and welcome to The Wrap, your weekly look at North Carolina politics. I'm WRAL State Government Reporter Travis Fain.
And I am WRAL State Government Reporter Will Doran.
And I think the last time I was on The Wrap, which was 2 weeks ago, it was mostly about how we totally believed North Carolina lawmakers would pass a budget this week. Sorry, y'all.
I think a lot of North Carolina lawmakers honestly believed they were going to pass a budget, and no.
Yeah, you almost never go wrong thinking things will happen later than they do, and that's what's happening. So this week the budget negotiations essentially fell apart. We can put them back together again. The two sides, the House and the Senate, both Republican controlled, are talking again. But for a day there, like everybody or some people got in their feelings a little bit on this, Will.
Yeah, there was some kind of spicy back and forth between Senate and House leadership about broken promises and failure to get the troops in line.
Yeah, and so what basically had happened is, Tim Moore, Speaker of the House, and Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger, they're the top guys. They're negotiating this $30 billion budget. Berger is insisting that it include language in it to allow 4 new casinos and some version of video poker, video lottery terminals, those things you see in gas stations, people playing like a slot machine. We still haven't seen language on that, but it has to be in the budget. Berger says, well, Moore told me that we could move forward like that. He'd get the votes for that. And constantly we've heard from the House, from the Speaker, that if that deal gets at least half of the House Republican caucus, the House Republican majority, well, we'll bring it to the floor and vote for it. But there was a caveat that Moore says was obvious and other people say was not so obvious, and that's, well, we also have to have 61 votes, enough to pass it through the House. So we have to have enough Democrats. And when Moore said, hey, I don't have enough Democrats, we don't have 61 votes, I'm not putting this budget onto the floor, that is when Berger got pretty angry and basically said, this is no longer about casinos. This is about whether or not I have someone on the other side in the House who will negotiate in good faith. Is that pretty fair summary there?
Yeah. No, he was publicly angry, which you don't often see.
Not from Berger. Berger is the guy who wins negotiations because he's doesn't make it personal and he doesn't want much usually. And now he wants something, and it seemed like it got personal for him. His face, like the anger, and I know this is a visual medium, podcasting, but the anger in his face was clear in a way that not only I found interesting, but other reporters who gaggle with him, talk to him, almost daily during session. It really struck us all. And meanwhile, Tim Moore's on the other side, like, hey, guys, how you doing? Blah, 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 which, as I've said before, kind of like a backslap come to life. Did not seem as affected by this. The two men have since had at least 2 meetings I saw them walk out of and are continuing talks. But I don't think anyone expects a budget in the next few days, Will.
No, they do not. I talked to spokespeople for both Berger and Moore on Thursday night, and they did not seem to anticipate any sort of news happening anytime soon.
Yeah, because the positions haven't changed. It's you got to do it this way with the gambling in it versus I don't have the votes for that. Berger wants the House to just put it on the floor, call everybody's bluff basically, and see if Democrats will really vote against Medicaid expansion and Republicans will really vote against a budget that has tax cuts in it and opportunity scholarships, private school vouchers, a massive increase in that.
Yeah, well, and one interesting wrinkle on this is, as you said, Tim Moore doesn't think that he has enough Democratic votes to get to a total of 61 with where his, fellow Republicans are. And we heard from the House Democratic leader, Robert Reeves, on Thursday. He said no one has asked him about the budget, about whether Democrats want to vote for it or not. He said he's heard rumors, that Republicans have gone to a couple individual Democrats hoping to pick them off. But he said, no one's come to me to try to negotiate, to try and say, hey, can you deliver us some Democratic votes for this budget if we do X, Y, and Z? And so he said that this coming week, Democrats are going to put out a proposal of their own that he said, could get them working on a budget deal. It's going to have higher raises for state employees, lower than what Democrats had originally proposed earlier this year, but higher than what Republicans want to do. Sounds like there might be some stuff on early childhood education, a couple other Democratic priorities. we talked to Berger and Moore. Neither of them seemed too interested in working with Democrats on their priorities in order to get enough votes for the budget, although Senator Berger did say he's always open to hearing conversations. So.
I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but that early childhood education money is interesting because we're coming up on this into this pandemic era federal program that has basically been subsidizing daycare across the country. There's a concern that like a lot of daycares are about to close and people are going to leave the business because the money's not there. The Chamber of Commerce wants, I think it's $300 million over 2 years. Don't hold me to that number. But, I mean, the business community is involved in that. I was shocked that didn't end up in any budgets. Donnie Lambeth, the budget chairman, one of the budget chairmen in the House, was on board with it. Just hasn't happened. Worth noting when Reeves talks about, whether or not Democrats will vote for it, they haven't seen it. They are very much in step with the general public in that we have not, the Republican majority has not made public the $30 billion budget, with secret gambling plans in it.
Yeah, no one really has any idea what is holding up other than, the leaked drafts that we've gotten.
Yeah, we've gotten a leaked draft of the casino bill, not the VLT, the video lottery terminal bill.
Not the budget itself.
Yeah, I mean, PDFs are readily available to this society, so maybe
email them to us if you got them.
On this, also, I've got a story coming out, I think, Sunday, out of Rockingham County, where one of the casinos would be, and not coincidentally, Phil Berger's home county. And it's basically, there was this ordinance change back in June. I won't get into the details, but it basically is like, oh, gee, how'd they know to do that? Like, how'd they know that they needed to do this to prepare for this casino? And then when I asked the county leaders about it, the story kind of shifted a little bit, and people didn't want to talk to me. So you can read that on nccapital.com. Well, let's take just a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk election bills, we'll talk UNC and guns on campus, and get into a number of other things as well. All right, welcome back to The Wrap, where now we remember the ad breaks. I'm Travis Fain. This is with me is Will Doran. We're going to talk more politics. So, election bills. So there are two major ones. 749, I think, is the one we're about to talk about.
Correct. Yep.
Where do these things sit, and where are they about to sit?
So there's one that's already been passed, been vetoed by the governor, and is just awaiting a veto override. I don't think there's too much drama on that.
It's just a matter of like when Republicans have enough people in attendance to override, surely, right?
Right. Yeah. They're going to do it. It's just when is everybody back from vacation, and they've got the numbers to do it. And that's the bill that would get rid of for mail-in ballots, get rid of the grace period after the elections, to require mail-in ballots to be in on election night. Directly influenced by Donald Trump's claims in 2020 on election night that he had won the election, which obviously is not true. So that one is basically on the verge of becoming law. There was a little bit more drama on 749, the other one you mentioned, Travis, which is going to overhaul the State Board of Elections. That one has twice been pulled from planned votes in the House. In the last 2 weeks, it's been up for a vote and then got yanked out at the last second. And one time it seemed to be that there were, a lot of protesters at the building, and leadership just didn't really want to give them the satisfaction of
found some technical changes that needed to be made in the bill. They said, yeah.
And then the second time it was just a hostage of this whole budget snafu that we've been talking about. There was not really any more changes that need to be made. It was just, the House kind of picked up its ball and went home one day.
Well, and so, I mean, everybody kind of did. And I think there was also Lucille Sherman with Axios had a little piece about how a number of House Republicans walked off that day kind of angry with the speaker because they felt the gambling was being railroaded. So that was the same day, I believe, where they walked it. Jason Sain, who is a budget chairman, was quoted in that story as being angry. So it's not just the rank and file, but some of the leadership. But anyway, so the elections bill has been delayed. It's going to move forward at some point soon, maybe Tuesday, right?
Yes, and it is, we should note, it's almost certain to become law. It's also incredibly similar to a plan that has already been ruled unconstitutional. And so once it does become law, there's going to be a lawsuit filed over it. So we're going to be talking about this a lot more. There's going to be a lot more bites of the apple for people who want to learn more about this, but we've been writing about it every step of the way, and we'll continue to do so. Early voting is really the main thing that it could affect, but also the big concern by some critics is that it could make it more likely that for the 2024 presidential election or future ones, that the legislature would choose who gets our electoral votes.
Right. What happens if evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, which is what the bill would do, local and state board of elections declines to certify or fails to reach majority to certify an election? Does that kick it up to the General Assembly and the state law just basically says, and once it gets kicked up to the General Assembly, and we're not 100% sure that it will, but that certainly seems like a possibility worth worrying about.
Yeah.
It basically just says, well, then they decide the will of the voters, and that's not appealable. So a concern that's been expressed by Governor Roy Cooper and others.
Yep.
We had another gun on campus at UNC. Somebody robbed, I think, a bagel store, if I'm right about it.
I think it was even less than that. It was just kind of a personal dispute. Someone was angry at someone who worked at the bagel store, pulled out a gun, waved it around, never shot it, left.
Yet another campus lockdown, though.
Of course, yeah. It was only a week or two after the murder on campus.
And it was one day after a bunch of UNC students, maybe, 50, I can't remember how many I saw, came to the General Assembly. They were in the House gallery. They chanted, they want some different gun measures. And Speaker of the House, Tim Moore, responded to that the next day, couple of days, based on the fact that, it happened again. There was another campus lockdown at UNC because of a gun. And you wrote a story about that.
Yeah, we asked him, what, if anything, should the legislature do? We asked both Berger and Moore this question. Berger said, basically, I don't know if there's anything we can do that would have stopped either of these situations from happening. Moore went a little bit further. He said, specifically, legislature's not going to pass these red flag laws that, Congress has approved now to take away guns from people in mental distress or who are, deemed to be a threat to themselves or others. That just has no traction with the Republicans. But he said, he's been thinking about this a lot because he has a son who's a student at UNC, and he said he's heard from plenty of other students who say, look, if there's all these people, carrying guns on campus, apparently, I'm a law-abiding person. Why shouldn't I be able to? So he said that, he'd be looking at potentially revoking the gun-free zone status of UNC or potentially all universities. And, that's obviously a really emotional debate by a lot of people. Some people say, yeah, I'm a responsible gun owner. I should be able to defend myself from these people who are, bringing guns onto campus, even though guns are technically banned. Then you have other people like we heard from Representative Reeves, the Democratic leader, who was just incredulous at Moore's comments and said, he like Moore is also a UNC grad, and he's like, if I'm frightened to think how my life would be different if my friends and I had guns or access to guns on campus when we were 19, 20 years old.
Yeah, and I think Berger in the Senate threw some cold water on that idea pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it seems like just with guns, we just wait for the next terrible thing to happen and hope it's not too terrible, and then the debate ignites again, and then the legislature doesn't do anything, either because there's nothing to be done or, Democrats certainly would like to see it made a little bit harder to get a gun and a lot easier to take someone's gun if a judge could order that. That's what that red flag law would do. So,
yeah,
round and round.
Our own U.S. Senator Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, is the one who kind of spearheaded that red flag push in Congress.
That bill that Tillis passed is real strict, though. To the point to where I talked to him months, if not a year, after it had been implemented, and no state had qualified for the federal funding by passing a red flag law. That got portrayed, I think, a lot as very pro red flag law, when in fact, if you want the federal money to implement it, you have to pass a red flag law that people would say, really protects people's rights against having their guns taken away. So.
Yeah. Well,
I'll mention quickly a child abuse bill. So there's this omnibus bill with a bunch of juvenile issues, foster care, adoption, other issues. Senate Bill 625. At one point, it had language in it that came out of some deaths that happened in Nash County, including a little girl, 8-year-old girl named Crystal Lane. A terrible story. She was killed by her grandmother, allegedly, but I don't know that anyone is really disputing what happened here. The school system and the sheriff's office in the county had flagged things to the local DSS that were not followed up by taking the child out of this woman's custody. So the bill had something called Crystal's Law in it at one point, and it passed the Senate, I believe, unanimously, that would give the state more power to, I don't know that take over DSS is the right word, because they recently have taken over, this part of DSS, but more day-to-day oversight into these sorts of things. That got dropped from the bill from 625. Sarah Stevens, who handles these issues a lot in the House and is one of the top Republicans, I believe she's the pro tem in the House.
Yeah.
She removed it. She also, the bill would redefine negligence in a way that makes it easier to take kids into foster care, taken from their parents, if they spend too much time at the hospital. So if your kid has some sort of behavioral health episode, you can't deal with them, you don't have anywhere to go, because, mental health professionals are hard to find, hard to get appointments.
Right.
You go to the ER. If the ER is like, all right, well, we've done everything we can do, and you don't take the kid home within 48 hours, this would allow the state to step in more easily. I don't understand the full nuances. I know Disability Rights is against it. They're a watchdog group for people with disabilities. The DHHS, so Governor Roy Cooper's administration, opposes this language. The bill also has some adoption language that Representative Stevens put in. Tammy Fitzgerald at the Family Values Coalition opposes that. And I mention all this to say, boy, if you can get Roy Cooper's administration and Tammy Fitzgerald to dislike your foster care adoption bill, you've accomplished something.
They see eye to eye on almost nothing.
Almost nothing. Representative Stevens inspires that feeling from time to time in people. She's very active in legislation that comes through her committees. She said that, look, we're still talking. I basically wanted to put this out there after working on it to have other people help me with this. So that's going to be, again, 625, something that continues to get discussed. The whole conflagration over Justice Anita Earls and the inquiry into her, that kind of continued this week with some comments that were pretty interesting from Representative Abe Jones, a former judge himself. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, so for people who don't remember what we're talking about here, Justice Anita Earls, Supreme Court Justice, is under investigation by the state's Judicial Standards Commission. It's in charge of ethics oversight for judges, for making some comments about racial and gender biases at the Supreme Court.
Right. She basically said, hey, the courts aren't always unbiased and non-racist.
Correct. And she is now under investigation for that. And the way that it works, those investigations are very confidential. The existence of the investigation itself is secret. It only became public because she filed a lawsuit trying to stop it, saying it's a First Amendment violation.
She feels targeted by the Republican majority on the Supreme Court, and that they're coming after her.
Correct. And that was part of her comments that have landed her under investigation. It kind of snowballs. But the identity of who actually started the investigation is also kept a secret, which was a rule that I think probably a lot of people think makes sense because, you have to, a lot of times it's lawyers filing complaints against judges who they see in the courtroom, maybe they're showing up, on the bench drunk, or they're, making some biased rulings or something like that. And the lawyer is not going to necessarily file a complaint unless they know they can do so anonymously, because what happens if the complaint goes nowhere? Well, they're never going to win a case in front of that judge again. So it makes sense to keep these things secret. But what we heard from Representative Jones, former Wake County judge, is that he knows that this was started by Paul Newby, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's a pretty explosive allegation. The Chief Justice personally pushing for a fellow Supreme Court justice to be investigated. And the investigation, could potentially end with her being kicked off the Supreme Court and even permanently banned from ever being a judge again. It could also just result in a strongly worded letter. But there's there's degrees. I asked Representative Jones, that's a big accusation you're making against the head of the judicial branch. Back it up.
How do you know that? Yeah.
And he said, well, like you press guys say, I've got my sources, I've got to protect them, but trust me. No, like I said, he was a judge for 17 years. He certainly knows people in the legal community. If this was just some random person on the street, I think it would carry a little bit less weight than someone who was, spent 2 decades as a judge and is now a state lawmaker. But, this, is obviously really political. The Supreme Court in general has been really political, and increasingly so over the last decade or so. But this is, just one more step in that direction.
Yeah, and I think this is the third week we've talked about it as a federal lawsuit continues. So just gonna stay in the news. House Bill 542. This is like cracks down on HOAs, homeowners associations. It got a significant amendment in the Senate this week. We'll head back to the House. Senate voted on it 46-0. But if you're following that bill, that's one that is probably going to continue to morph. We'll also mention briefly House Bill 678. That's the clean energy bill that kind of favors nuclear power by changing, I think the words renewable energy to clean energy, or I'm reversing that. The Senate declined to concur, so that goes back to the House. There'll be changes on that. You watch any of the Republican gubernatorial debates? There were a couple. Debate might be a strong word. Forum. Wake County GOP had one.
I missed the Charlotte one. There was one in Cary as well. Saw part of. We weren't at it. They had it on I think probably the busiest day of the entire political year so far, on Tuesday, when the budget negotiations were blowing up, and we had Mark Harris jumping into Congress.
We're going to talk about that in a minute. Don't worry.
But it was Mark Robinson, who's obviously the front runner in that race, didn't show up. And typically, that's sort of the advice that political consultants will give. And they say, if you're leading, you really only have things to lose by engaging in a debate.
Right. But this isn't, WRAL trying to host a debate and you say, oh, well, the hell of the liberal media, I ain't got to show up for that. This is the grassroots. These are county parties, or at least the Wake County debate. I can't remember who hosted the one in Charlotte. It might have been a Republican women's group. I can't remember. But this is the grassroots asking you to come and explain yourself to them. And with him saying no and also being unengaged on major issues, like we've asked him, well, what do you think about this casino stuff? He's the president of the Senate. He never he has shown up once in the last 5 months that I can think of. But these are things where he's just not publicly stating his opinion. I wonder, will that wear on the grassroots? He's very popular. Is that going to be the kind of thing that erodes that support? I don't know. The other thing that I took out of the Wake County debate, I watched maybe half of it, maybe a little bit more. Jesse Thomas, who's kind of a late addition, his platform appears to be Medicaid expansion now and corporate tax cuts. That seems to be his two-pronged thing. So if you're wondering what he's about, that's what he's about, best I can tell. I also would notice when he called the Medicaid delay that's happening now as part of the state budget process, because the budget has to pass for Medicaid expansion to take effect, he called that unconscionable. The delay is unconscionable. And that was an applause line in the Wake County Republican Party meeting, which those are hardcore Republicans here in Wake County. And they're applauding because they want a policy that the Republican Party fought for 13 years. That surprised me a little bit.
You got to think about the audience too. I mean, this was at a country club in Cary. I have to imagine there were more than a few doctors in attendance. And obviously, Medicaid expansion is going to mean hundreds of millions of dollars for the healthcare industry. So
you make a good point. Geography is,
I don't know if that line will play as well, in other locations.
Well, it might, though, because, it helps rural areas. I don't know. It's just interesting. As you mentioned, Mark Harris, whose campaign perpetrated the only proven voter fraud in, U.S. history? Like recent U.S. history.
Certainly recent history, yeah.
Running for Congress again and doing so on a revisionist history platform, saying, I was framed by the liberal woke media and Democrats. And, there was information that didn't come out that I'm also not going to say what it is, that, proves that so what happened, for anyone who doesn't remember, is the mail-in ballots out of Bladen and Robinson County were stilted wildly toward Mark Harris in the 2018 9th Congressional District. And it turned out that he had a guy named McCrae Dallas, who has since passed on, who was, ballot harvesting essentially. And boy, it turned out that those results were very heavily stilted toward Mark Harris. And I mean really heavily.
And it was hundreds of ballots in a race that I think was determined by only less than 1,000 votes.
It was close. These ballots I do not think would have changed the race. But anyway, there were State Board of Elections hearings. Mark Harris, his son gets up and gives testimony that is against what his father said, because his father's like, no one told me this is a bad idea and this guy shouldn't be trusted. And John Harris gets up and says, I told my dad that this is a bad idea and that this guy shouldn't be trusted. And then Harris is back on the stand and clearly under some duress and testifying on a thing where Josh Lawson, who was the attorney at the time for the State Board of Elections, is kind of hammering him on, saying, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" That the man was moments away from perjuring himself if he had not, when Mark Harris's attorney stood up, stopped the proceedings, went back, talked to his client. They come back. Mark Harris says, "Okay,
never mind.
We need to have a new election."
Yeah.
And now he's like, that was unfair.
Yeah, I think he said it was, like you said, the Democrats essentially framed him to pursue a woke agenda. And it was his son's testimony that ended it. His son is a former federal prosecutor and a fellow Republican politician. And I should note that this whole investigation was led by Kim Strack, the elections director at the time, who's a Republican, appointed by Pat McCrory.
Right.
So,
good luck, everybody, with that. Locke Faircloth, former United States Senator, he passed away this week, Thursday. He was 95 years old, Will. He he was in the United States Senate for North Carolina for one term. He's a farmer, very well off.
He was kind of emblematic, right, of this trend that we've seen in North Carolina of conservatives switching over from the Democratic to the Republican Party. We used to be a one-party state. Everybody was a Democrat. And he was probably not the first example, but one of the most well-known examples of, hardcore conservatives who had been Democrats becoming Republicans and finding success.
Yeah, and I read Gary Robertson's obituary of him, which is always a good idea when one of these old school guys dies. And it had this thing where, he's running for governor, and this is 1983, and he's in western North Carolina in a small plane. He and Brad Crone, who is a fairly well-known operative in North Carolina politics. So the plane's going down, and it hit water on a grassy runway, crashed through trees, and skidded into a river. This is Gary's writing here. Faircloth, Crone, and two others got out of the plane and swam through burning gasoline to safety before the main fuel tank exploded. Crone said Thursday that all four of them would have died had Faircloth not willed the door open on the plane. The cabin was quickly filling with smoke and flames. So that is movie stuff.
That was 1983. So he would have been, if he's died at 95 now, he would have been in his 50s, if not 60s at the time, right? Kicking open the door of a crashed plane. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was, in an interesting obituary, obviously the most interesting thing. I would also recommend to y'all Jim Morrill for the Assembly wrote a long piece about Tim Moore and his kind of long list of controversies. I back when the affair came to light with the Speaker of the House, Tim Moore, I made a list of all the stuff, various things with women, various things with the business deals, the chicken plant he flipped, and I was going through Jim's article, and he had some that weren't on my list that I didn't know about, but I was like, oh, so they just published their list, and added some context to it. But I do recommend that folks read it again, Jim Morrill. For the Assembly, I would also note that Steve Troxler has endorsed John Hardister in the Labor Commissioner race. That's, as endorsements go, a fairly big one. The popular Agriculture Commissioner endorsing John Hardister, state representative, running for Labor Commissioner as a Republican. That's all I've got. Will, you got anything else?
I don't think so. I think a lot of those, candidate filings and, not filings, but announcements for 2024 are going to be heating up here. We actually, on Thursday, spoke with Senator Berger. He said redistricting, when they come back and do it, they're going to do the congressional lines first and then take a break and come back and draw the legislative lines later. So I would assume that probably means some state legislators are thinking about running for Congress.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I did not know that, so that's good information. So I don't know what to tell people to expect next week.
We're just going to take it day by day. I think that might even be what leadership is doing.
Sometimes it feels like they're keeping secrets. All the time it feels like they're keeping secrets, but sometimes it also feels like they don't tell us because they don't know. So
we'll find out which one it is sooner or later.
All right. We hope everybody has a good weekend and a good next week. Thanks for joining us on The Wrap.